This is Tornado Talk, a weekly podcast about one of nature's most fascinating phenomenons. Share your tornado story online by email or call us toll-free 800-439-1570. That's 800-439-1570. Now, meteorologist Jennifer Naramore and Dan Holliday, Tornado Talk is on.
On June 8th, 1966, the song at the top of the charts was this. The legendary Dick Van Dyke Show had just finished its last episode.
Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. I'm gonna say goodbye. I think that she all river so goodbye.
Batmobile mania was all the craze.
To the Batmobile. Let's go.
Lyndon B. Johnson was President of the United States.
There is no cause to doubt the American commitment. Our decision to stand firm has been matched by our desire for peace.
And you could own a new portable AM transistor radio for $1.
It's a real radio and it works great.
Those are the things we fondly admire from 50 years ago. But on June 8th, 1966, what happened in Topeka, Kansas would change everything in a matter of minutes.
This is Topeka, Kansas, and this is the aftermath of the most destructive tornado ever to strike the state capital. It sliced a path of death and damage a half-mile wide and 15 miles long. 3,500 people were homeless, 500 homes and 50 businesses destroyed. Damage estimated at $100 million.
What caused the devastating Topeka, Kansas tornado? Warning coordination meteorologist Chad Omit from the National Weather Service.
We had a low-pressure system with a warm front in the area, combined with a storm system that was moving out of the Rockies, and everything was in place for another round of severe storms later in that day.
Bill Kurtis, on the air at WIBW-TV, tried to find the way to warn residents a tornado was tearing through Topeka.
I had to do something that would get people's attention. I thought about cussing. I thought about crying, because I felt an hysteria building up.
Carol Yoho was just a teenager and remembers losing her neighborhood.
And I saw my friend as she was standing at the corner, and I said, "Patty, is your house okay?" And she said, "What house? It's gone."
Zach Ahrens, president of the Topeka Capital Journal, talks about how the newspaper kept those informed in the aftermath.
The Lawrence paper at the time helped us to publish the edition, is what we actually printed on the front page on Thursday, June 9th, 1966, the day after the tornado.
This is the 50th anniversary special and tribute to the many who witnessed the Topeka, Kansas tornado on June 8, 1966. According to a Native American legend, a local landmark, Burnett's Mound, would protect the city from tornadoes. It was named after Potawatomi Indian chief Abram Burnett. Local residents believe the 250-foot hill would cause tornadoes to dissipate. Even though tornadoes had struck the city 10 times before 1966, this would be the biggest.
At 11 a.m. that morning, the U.S. Weather Bureau issued a tornado watch, valid from 2 p.m. until 8 p.m. for south central and eastern Kansas, as well as west central Missouri. The statement said the threat of 1 to 2 tornadoes would exist that Wednesday evening.
Chad Omit at the National Weather Service in Topeka said the atmosphere had set up like it does many times when tornadoes occur in Kansas.
Well, we were in an active pattern, which is not uncommon for parts of late May into early June across the Central Plains. We actually were seeing a couple of days worth of severe storms across the Central Plains, and the day before, which would have been June 7th, 1966, they had an active weather day with severe storms across parts of central Kansas and a lot of heavy rains. And that really set the stage with the storm system moving out of the Rockies and a low-pressure system that developed across parts of southwest Kansas. And to the east-northeast of that low-pressure system, we had a warm front that extended really towards I-70. If you don't know where I-70 is, it's basically the north-central part of the state, runs east-west across the state, and that warm front extended nearly right along the interstate across Kansas and into parts of northeast Kansas, and that was the situation early on June 8th, is that we had a low-pressure system with a warm front in the area, combined with a storm system that was moving out of the Rockies, and everything was in place for another round of severe thunderstorms later in that day.
By mid-afternoon, the storm system was brewing and lining up for Topeka.
We basically saw storms develop near the warm front. As the low was moving east-northeast into north-central parts of Kansas, we saw thunderstorms develop in the vicinity of the warm front. And then to the south, we started to see more thunderstorms develop down to the south from parts of north-central Kansas down towards the Wichita area, down towards south-central Kansas as well. And so that was the situation late in the day. We saw thunderstorms develop by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and those storms continued to develop and move across parts of northeast Kansas later on in the afternoon into the early evening hours.
Bill Kurtis was born in Pensacola, Florida. His dad was in the military, and upon his dad's retirement, his family settled in Independence, Kansas when he was just 16 years old. He's an award-winning journalist, producer, and news anchor, seen on American Justice, Cold Case Files, the CBS Morning News, and NPR's quiz show, Wait, Don't Tell Me. He also had the role of the narrator in Anchorman 1 and 2. Long before all of that, Kurtis worked at WIBW-TV, and he was on camera the evening a tornado changed Topeka, Kansas.
I was filling in for Tom Parmley, who was the news director, and was going to do the 6 o'clock news. I had to leave my law review class, Washburn Law School at Carnegie Hall. And so I arrived about 5 o'clock, went over the news, the scripts, the stories, the visuals, trying to line them up, and got ready to go on at 6. Well, it was clear that we were having, some high winds. The report we got from Manhattan was that high winds had taken a roof off a garage. But that was about the extent of it. In fact, but we just got the lesser warning. And so it put us on a bit of an alert. And then around 6:30, 6:40, it got a little more serious. And we had a two-way communication with our film cameraman who lived out around Burnett's Mound at the southwest edge of the city. And he said, well, we have a tornado. I see a tornado. I think it's on the ground. What was happening was that the tornado had started in Dover, which was, 30, 40 miles away. And they start as the white funnel clouds. It was not the big tornado that it would grow into. So at that moment, why he said, we can... you could go on, and we did, giving not the official warning, but a watch, because we weren't convinced that it was going to be on the ground. I mean, who would believe that it would be, the most destructive tornado in U.S. history from that point? It was headed for Burnett's Mound. What we did not know was that it was lifting at some farms combines and turning them end over end. It would hit as it came around the northwest side of Burnett's Mound. A Shetland pony farm killed about 150. And then our general manager, Charlie Ross, said, well, we better go back on. We didn't know any of this, incidentally, because, you're blind when you're in the studio. And unless you have spotters out there, and Ed was in a position where no one can get the full scope of what was happening, we decided, okay, let's go on at the top of the hour. The reason is you don't want to interrupt the program, and if it's a false alarm, it's very disrupting to a lot of people, and they get mad. So we said, okay, we'll go on at 7 o'clock. We prepared. I was in my white shirt and without a coat, as I recall. And I had the bulletins standing in front of the camera and the weather map in front of me. And start in. Charlie had given the go-ahead to do that. They had been following it through the day, so, we were all generally aware there would be severe thunderstorms and high winds. Nevertheless, in the middle of, my presentation, I heard another two-way radio report from Ed Rutherford. It said, tornado on the ground, just past Burnett's Mound. It's wiped out the Huntington apartment complex, which was part of a large complex, the Embassy Apartments, and 200 apartments were inside. I knew that. So suddenly I realized that, if you blast 200 apartments, it's now on the ground, but it's on the ground in a very big way. It would later be judged an EF5. And if I drew a line, all this is happening in less than a second, just flashes, from the first Ed Rutherford sighting to now the second. The line was pointed directly toward the Capitol building, Topeka State Hospital, Washburn University, and residents in between, and shopping malls, and downtown, eventually. So I knew that I had to give some kind of a warning, and it had to be out of the ordinary. It wasn't just reading a tornado alert. It was, I had to do something that would get people's attention. I thought about cussing. I thought about crying, because I felt an hysteria building up inside, because I knew, this is the moment when you got to get them into the basement, or, lives will be lost. So I said, for God's sake, take cover. And it was said with an emotion and passion, and I guess truth, that a lot of people got the message. I had a wife and a 6-month-old baby on married housing on the Washburn campus. I had told her that I would call her if it was really serious, but I'm on camera. I didn't have a chance. And so some neighbors grabbed her, and they all went up to the science building, wrote it out down in the basement. The story, evolves from there. It stayed on the ground for 12 to 18 miles.
Carol Yoho was 16 years old the day Topeka was hit by the deadly tornado. She vividly recalls what happened that day.
What I remember was I went downtown just south of the Capitol building to the Masonic Temple. I was with a girls group that were going to a convention, I think the next day or the day after, and we were going to sing, so we were going to practice. And we were in a big room with windows looking west, and we watched the clouds and listened to the radio, and it just got darker and scarier, and I've never seen clouds that looked like the ones that did that night. They were yellow and they were green, and it was just really spooky. And as we listened, they said that the tornado was forming, that it had come down, it was coming toward us, and then we decided we'd go to the basement. So we went to the basement, and I never saw the storm, but I surely heard it. And we were in a very strong, well-built building, so that wasn't a factor. Some of the windows were blown out, but when we came up, there were damaged cars outdoors, but luckily mine wasn't, and we'd all survived.
Meanwhile, WREN radio reporter Rick Douglas was urging people to take cover as he was driving down Burnett's Mound. When he reached an overpass at Interstate 70, a police officer had stopped traffic. With the tornado approaching, he had no time to go back on the air and ran for shelter under the overpass.
Douglas was picked up off the ground by the twister and covered in mud and debris. When he arrived at a hospital, a nurse thought he had died and covered his face. He said for years he found shards of debris that were embedded in his skin.
Bill Kurtis continued gathering information for WIBW-TV on what happened.
It stayed on the ground for 12 to 18 miles. All of that time through a populated area. It wiped out virtually Washburn University and beautiful old sandstone buildings. They were in piles when the kids came up from the basement of the science building. Science building was hit square, but it stood. It was a modern building. The others were those old, beautiful sandstones. My wife, Helen, was up against the door of the elevator and was kind of sucked up against it, feeling the power of the winds and the low pressure change. Mary Kristen made it okay. And when they came up, there were cars and trees down in the light wells leading down into the basement. And there was the law school, roof off. Many buildings, just totally destroyed. Trees gone. And almost every tree on campus, beautiful trees. But there it went. On past, now it was headed to rip a hole out of the iron dome of the Capitol building, hit downtown, make one of the buildings almost kind of the tallest uninhabitable, and then on to move railroad cars around. Did a lot of damage to the east side of Topeka, and then on out the airport. So you've got probably 200 to 300 mile an hour winds in EF5. There was no rating system at the time.
Like so many others, Carol Yoho wanted to get home and make sure her friends and family were okay.
I was primarily thinking about myself and taking care of myself because I'm an only child. I knew my parents would be concerned about me. In fact, I will tell you that after it was over and I was okay, I used the telephone there to try and call home to tell them I was all right. And the line was busy, and I didn't think too much of that. I just thought, well, I'll go on home. It was the getting home, the being home, and everything after that was total terror.
Carol described what it felt like finding her way back to where she lived.
Trying to go home, I kept running into damage from the storm because it was an exact direct direction to my home that I was headed back. So I kept having to go west and then go south and go west again and then go south until I showed up at 17th and College Boulevard, which was facing the Washburn campus, and everything was blocked, and I knew there that there was some serious problems. The buildings were rubble. There was no traveling any farther south, west, or east from there. I had to turn around and go backward. And when I saw the college campus, I started getting very nervous about what I was going to find at home because we lived at the dead end of 21st and Randolph, where there's a K&I building now, but it's a dead end, and then there's Shunga Creek. And I think the storm hit Burnett's Mound, went through the 29th and Gage area, then through these fields that would be the VA hospital grounds, and then it hit our homes before it went on to Washburn. And when I got to 21st and Randolph, they wouldn't let me drive any farther. They had us pull over, stop, and said, if you want to go any farther, you'll have to walk. And I was nervous about that because there were a lot of downed power lines, but I thought, I got to get home. And I saw my friend. She lived on Shunga Drive, and she was standing at the corner, and I said, Patty, is your house okay? And she said, what house? It's gone. And that's where my stomach really sank. And I started down the street, and the farther I went, the worse it was. And I got down to our dead-end part, and there was nothing there I recognized. I had to literally count houses from the corner to figure out which one was ours. There was no roof. There were no walls. There was no ceiling. Everything was mud-covered. It was there that I knew that we were in big trouble.
While the Fujita Scale for tornadoes was not in place 50 years ago, it was rated years later. The damage was massive. Chad Omit at the National Weather Service said the Topeka tornado ranks as one of the worst ever.
Well, it was an F5, as high as it gets. The Fujita Scale winds estimated over 200 miles an hour at the time, perhaps approaching 250 miles an hour back then. Citywide, just tremendous damage. In fact, to this day, the Topeka tornado still ranks number 4 all time on the costliest tornadoes to strike the United States. And so just incredible amounts of damage across the city, and really Topeka took a direct hit from the storm. And it was rated an F5.
Looking back, Chad Omid said despite the lack of technology, forecasters used what they had, and they used it well.
What was interesting about the tools that we used back then at the weather office is they did have a radar. It was called something, there was a Weather Surveillance Radar 3, WSR3. And they were able to see the thunderstorms approach, and yet, because of the limitations of the technology back then, we really weren't able to see much in the way of interesting features. And by that, I'm talking about hook echoes, which was back then, it was something they used to hang their hat on. They used to really focus and watch for those hook echoes, because back then they assumed that hook echoes automatically meant a tornado. And so they were able to see a hook echo, but it wasn't until a little after 7. And by the time they actually saw it, it was entering the city of Topeka at the time. And so that was what was interesting about that case, is they were able to see the hook, and they issued the warning once they did see that. But at the same time, I think one of the most important aspects of what happened here in Topeka and helped to really minimize life lost was the very good preparedness and spotter network that they had in place, preparedness program, and they had people out and about looking for this stuff, and people saw it and were able to report it into the Weather Bureau back then, and then also to report it to the media. And so we had all facets, really, from the Civil Defense Department to the Weather Bureau to the media, and that's where Bill Kurtis came in and really was able to convey the seriousness of the event and get people to really pay attention and personalize the threat and get them to take shelter.
One very important thing was the warning system. The fact is, we had a warning system. You know, the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, they had no warning. The tsunami, they had no warning. Earthquakes have no warning. But Richard Garrett, who was chief meteorologist at the U.S. Weather Bureau, in the 50s had begun a dream, which was to set up a system that would warn people that a tornado was coming. And he used spotters, live people, out at various portions on the southwestern and western edge of the city. He used his radar, left over from World War II. Wasn't very good, especially compared to weather systems today. He had media that were trained and connected to give the alert and the warning. So, and he had civil defense. Civil defense was set up for nuclear possible attacks, during the 50s. But we had nuclear bombers flying out of Forbes Air Force Base, stationed there in Topeka. And so the government was very interested because they thought Topeka might be a prime target. So they put up 19 very powerful sirens. The Department of Defense did not want to have those used as tornado warnings. They were for wartime use only. But a la Catch-22, Richard Garrett and the chief of the Topeka Civil Defense appropriated them and converted them into a tornado warning. So you had a system, and neither of us knew the other participants. Only Garrett knew his network. We didn't train. We didn't rehearse. We knew our jobs, though. And when the time came, we did our jobs. And it worked.
Despite the warning, a tornado that large often claims lives. Carol Yoho fondly remembers a friend who couldn't get to shelter in time.
A friend of ours, 1 block away, was home that night. His family knew that there was danger. They tried to call him, and he didn't answer. And when they got home, they found him wrapped in a tree. They took him to the hospital, and he died. So he was one of the 16 who died, and he had just graduated from high school, a week or two before the mess. So I see pictures of him from time to time, and I burst into tears because he was one that did not survive. And, a lot of our stuff got completely lost. We were okay, and when it came down to it, that's what mattered.
Back in 1966, the local newspaper was the Topeka Daily Capital. Current president and publisher Zach Ahrens said they printed a paper on June 8th, but had help the day after from the Lawrence newspaper staff. He described how the media pulled the community together after the disaster.
You know, Topeka at that point really stepped into action. I mean, they could have, on the Washburn campus, they could have said, we're not going to rebuild, right? And they elected to move forward right away, rebuilding. I think things that I probably wouldn't have thought of, planting trees right away. That process started as well. So those aspects to me are impressive. The other thing that came up, and we have this captured through photographs, and this also came out during the interviews, both the oral interviews and then those that we actually videoed as well and is available on our website. What's interesting to me is the humor that came out of this, that even in the midst of such destruction and loss of life, loss of property, people still maintain their humor through that whole process. And so we have some of that captured as well. So just really seeing almost the whole process of unbelief, disbelief, shock, then wow, look what the aftermath is, you know, this F5 coming through, and then the humor and the rebuilding. So just great testimony to the people here.
50 years ago, many of us weren't here when the Topeka tornado struck. But for those who were, there are stories of survival and gratitude that stay in their hearts for a lifetime.
The most satisfying thing about it all were the reactions that came in from people who happened to be watching television. A lot of people were, because we were the only TV station in town. Some people could pick up Kansas City. But we were CBS, and Lost in Space was a very popular program. They got the message, they went to the basement, and afterwards, the letters poured in. I've never seen a reaction like this. And they just bring tears to your eyes. You saved my life. Thank you for, such a job. And in many markets, there is one sort of bonding experience at a TV or radio station in which it served the public. This was the highest service a broadcaster could ever do, and people remember. I went down to Emporia, which is about 60 miles away, a number of years ago, and I was going to give a speech dedicating the Pioneer Woman in Council Grove. And it was hot, typical hot afternoon, and the sun was out, and there wasn't much shade, and the stands were full. So I went ahead and I gave my little talk, tried to speak fast, and I went over afterwards and I said, "What are you doing? In the sun, don't you know it's hot out?" They said, "Well, we were there, and we wanted to come thank you for the tornado coverage." And even those who were not in Topeka, they were in the surrounding towns, were glued to their radios. Our AM station, we simulcast, and we reached 95 out of 105 counties in Kansas. And that moment was so just indelible in their lives. It changed their lives too. And they sat in the sun to meet me and say thanks.
Carol Yoho is thankful for what she found in a pile of rubble. Rubble that used to be her home.
Our house was unrecognizable. It had no roof. It had no ceilings. It had no outer walls. Everything was covered in mud. The grass had been pulled out by the roots. And the family came in to help. As we gathered things, I went back a day or two to try and help. And our next-door neighbor, of course, was in the same boat we were in. So one day I stopped to talk with her in her yard. And something was glinting in the sunlight. And I thought, what am I seeing? So I walked over, bent down, and picked up from the mud what I was seeing, and I recognized it immediately as my mother's wedding ring, which she did not have on at the time of the storm. Unfortunately, we never found her engagement ring because it has a bigger stone in it. But the fact that I would pick up and recognize and know that that was Mom's ring meant a great deal to me. And she's gone now, but I've always saved the ring, and it's very precious to me.
In a storm that affects so many, there are always more stories. Zach Ahrens of the Topeka Capital Journal says he and project manager Jan Biles spent countless hours collecting and reflecting for everyone to see.
The anniversary edition, which we've called Twist of Fate, is a 112-page commemorative edition. So it's full of photos, stories, interviews. We also have some before and after photos, are really now and then. So comparing what it looked like there 50 years ago versus today. So you'll see that. You'll get interviews of people reflecting back to that day. A lot of the photographs at that time, as I speak right now, flipping through this, I'm looking at these photographs, and it's just amazing, the stories that each one of these can tell just by looking at it. In addition, on our website, because like any good artist, you have to know when to put the brush down, right, and say, this is done. And so going to our website, you'll have 800 photographs, about 100 interviews that have gone on, and then also maps to be able to show the path of the tornado off of Burnett's Mound and then the destruction in the city. So you'll be able to see that as well. There is some stories and photographs that talk about during the destruction, the recovery, the memories, but then also going back to right before the tornado and checking out the landscape. The other thing I like is, and you had asked the question, is what was our coverage like on our daily news product in our newspaper at that time. And so we actually have the digitalized versions of our newspapers following that week of coverage.
The 50th anniversary edition, Twist of Fate, is online at tornado.cjonline.com. Also, you'll find the link on our website, tornadotalk.com.
50 years is a long time, but it lives in my heart, so you have to review it now and then, and you just feel lucky.
Next on Tornado Talk, damaging tornadoes tear through parts of Kansas. A tornado emergency for Dodge City one day and for Chapman, Kansas the next. Close calls on a look back at late May Kansas tornadoes.
This has been Tornado Talk, powered by thestormreport.com.